Have you ever wondered why so many African countries have perfectly straight borders? Or why nations that share the same language, culture, and history are sometimes divided by these invisible lines? Here's something that might shock you. In 1884, a group of European leaders gathered in Berlin and literally drew lines on a map, carving up an entire continent. They didn't consult a single African leader. They didn't consider existing kingdoms, ethnic groups, or centuries-old trade routes. They just drew lines. And those lines, they are still causing conflicts today, more than 60 years after most African nations gained independence. Today, we're diving deep into one of history's most consequential events and how it fundamentally reshaped African politics in ways we're still dealing with right now. Welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, we break down complex historical and political topics in ways that actually make sense. And if this is your kind of content, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss out. Now, when we talk about African politics today, whether it's ethnic tensions, corruption, border disputes, or struggles with democracy, we can't understand any of it without looking at colonialism. And I'm not just talking about the fact that colonialism happened. I'm talking about how it fundamentally restructured everything: political systems, economic relationships, social hierarchies, and even how Africans saw themselves and each other. This isn't about placing blame or dwelling on the past. This is about understanding cause and effect. Because if you want to understand why things are the way they are, you have to understand how they got that way. Before we talk about what colonialism did to Africa, we need to understand what Africa was before colonialism. And here's the thing. The Africa that existed before European colonization was nothing like what most people imagine. When you think of pre-colonial Africa, what comes to mind? If your education was anything like mine, you probably picture scattered tribes, primitive villages, and maybe some confusion about whether there were any real civilizations. But here's the reality. Africa had sophisticated kingdoms and empires with complex political systems, international trade networks, advanced metallurgy, impressive architectural achievements, and rich intellectual traditions. Let me give you some examples. The Mali Empire in West Africa was one of the wealthiest states in the world during the 14th century. Mansa Musa, the emperor, was literally the richest person in human history. When he went on pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324, he brought so much gold that he crashed the Egyptian economy for a decade. The Kingdom of Congo had a centralized government, a postal system, and diplomatic relations with Portugal as early as the 1480s. They had their own currency, professional army, and complex bureaucracy. Great Zimbabwe built massive stone structures without mortar, ruling over a territory larger than modern France, controlling gold and ivory trade routes that reached as far as China. The Ashanti Empire had a sophisticated constitution that limited the king's power, a merit-based bureaucracy, and an economy based on gold mining and trade. The point is, Africa had its own political systems. These weren't primitive or simple. They were diverse, sophisticated, and they worked for the societies that created them. Some were monarchies, others were more decentralized. Some had elaborate court systems, others had councils of elders. But they were all rooted in African realities, African values, and African needs. And then came the scramble for Africa, the meeting that changed everything. Picture this. It's November 1884. 14 European countries and the United States gather in Berlin. The purpose? To establish rules for colonizing Africa. Notice who wasn't invited? Any African representatives. This wasn't the beginning of European presence in Africa, but it was a moment when colonization became systematic and complete. Before Berlin, Europeans mostly controlled coastal areas. After Berlin, they wanted it all. The conference established some key principles. First, effective occupation. If you wanted to claim African territory, you had to actually occupy it with administration and military force. This led to a rush as European powers scrambled to claim as much land as possible. Second, freedom of trade. European nations could trade throughout the entire Congo basin without restrictions. This sounds nice until you realize it meant African resources were open season for European exploitation. Third, freedom of navigation. European ships could travel African rivers freely, giving them access to the continent's interior. But here's what's most important for our discussion. The borders drawn at Berlin and in the years following had nothing to do with African political realities. Let me repeat that. Nothing. The borders were drawn based on European interests, European rivalries, European geographic knowledge, which was often wrong, and European convenience. Rivers and meridians made neat borders on maps, so that's what they used. The result? Ethnic groups were split across multiple colonies. Traditional enemies were forced into the same territories. Historical trade routes were cut in half. Ancient kingdoms were divided and destroyed. The Somali people were split across 5 different territories. The Maasai were divided between British Kenya and German Tanganyika. The Bakongo people found themselves in 3 different colonies: French, Belgian, and Portuguese. One scholar calculated that the colonial borders divided about 177 ethnic groups. That's 177 groups of people with shared languages, cultures, and political systems who suddenly found themselves on opposite sides of artificial lines. And these arbitrary borders, they became the borders of independent African nations. Which brings us to one of colonialism's most lasting political impacts: engineering ethnic conflict. Now, here's where colonialism got really insidious in reshaping African politics. Divide and rule. Colonial powers quickly realized that controlling large populations with relatively small numbers of European administrators required a strategy. That strategy was to divide Africans against each other. They did this in several ways. First, they created and hardened ethnic identities. Now, ethnic groups existed before colonialism, obviously, but colonial powers took fluid, overlapping identities and turned them into fixed, rigid categories. They conducted censuses that forced people into single ethnic boxes. They created ethnic identification cards. They drew up tribal maps. In Rwanda, the colonial government issued identity cards that designated people as Hutu, Tutsi, or TWA. Before colonialism, these identities were more fluid. You could move between them through marriage, wealth accumulation, or cattle ownership. But the colonial government made them fixed and hereditary. We all know how tragically this ended in 1994. Second, they played favorites. Colonial administrators would elevate one ethnic group over others, giving them preferential access to education, government positions, and economic opportunities. The British favored the Baganda in Uganda, creating resentment among other groups. The Belgians favored the Tutsi minority in Rwanda and Burundi, creating a power imbalance that reversed after independence. The Germans and later the British favored certain groups in Tanganyika, setting up future conflicts. Why did they do this? Because it's easier to control people who are divided. If Africans were fighting each other, they weren't uniting against colonial rule. Third, they destroyed traditional political structures and replaced them with colonial hierarchies. Remember those sophisticated African political systems I mentioned earlier? Colonial powers systematically dismantled them. They removed traditional leaders who resisted, replaced them with compliant puppets, and stripped traditional institutions of real power. Where they kept traditional rulers, they made them subordinate to colonial administrators and forced them to implement unpopular colonial policies like forced labor and taxation. This did 2 devastating things. It broke the political systems that had evolved over centuries to suit African societies, and it delegitimized traditional authority in the eyes of the people. When independence came, there were no strong indigenous political institutions to build on. The result? Post-independence African leaders inherited states where ethnicity had been weaponized, where there was no tradition of legitimate political authority, and where the only model of governance they'd experienced was authoritarian colonial rule. Is it any wonder that ethnic politics and authoritarianism became common in post-independence Africa? Let's talk about the kind of governments colonial powers built in Africa, because this is crucial to understanding post-independence politics. The colonial state had one primary purpose: extraction. Extracting resources, extracting labor, extracting wealth to send back to Europe. Everything else was secondary. This meant several things. First, the colonial government was fundamentally undemocratic and authoritarian. There was no pretense of government by consent. Laws were imposed from above. Africans had no say in how they were governed. Dissent was crushed brutally. The only political culture that developed under colonialism was authoritarian. If you wanted to get things done, you didn't build consensus or win elections. You used force and coercion. This became the model that many post-independence leaders followed. Second, the colonial government was designed to be cheap and extractive, not developmental. Colonial powers didn't invest in broad-based education, healthcare, or infrastructure that would benefit Africans. They built only what was necessary to extract resources: ports to ship out minerals, railways to transport cash crops, administrative centers to control the population. At independence, most African countries had literacy rates below 10%. The Belgian Congo, one of the richest territories in terms of resources, had exactly 16 university graduates at independence. 16. In a country of over 13 million people. How do you build a functioning democracy with institutions, civil service, and informed citizenry when 90% of your population has never been to school? Third, the colonial state was built on coercion, not legitimacy. Tax collection relied on force. Labor was often forced. Laws were enforced through violence. The police and military existed not to protect citizens, but to protect the colonial regime from citizens. This is the model of statehood that independent Africa inherited. Not a state that served its people, but a state that extracted from them. Not a state that derived legitimacy from consent, but one that maintained control through force. Many scholars argue that this is why so many African states struggled with authoritarianism after independence. The leaders who took over weren't creating authoritarian systems. They were continuing the only system they'd known. Fourth, corruption was actually built into the colonial system. Low-ranking African officials were paid poorly but expected to survive and thrive through informal payments and unofficial taxation. Chiefs and local officials were expected to meet quotas for cash crops or labor, and how they achieved this was often overlooked. This created a political culture where the line between official duties and personal enrichment was blurry at best. After independence, this pattern continued and often accelerated. We can't separate politics from economics, because the colonial economy shaped post-independence politics in profound ways. Colonial powers restructured African economies to serve one purpose: feeding raw materials to European industries and providing markets for European manufactured goods. This meant monoculture economies. Colonies were forced to specialize in one or two cash crops or minerals. Ghana produced cocoa, Zambia produced copper, Senegal produced peanuts, Kenya produced coffee and tea. This made African economies extremely vulnerable to price fluctuations and global market changes. No industrialization. Colonial powers actively prevented African colonies from developing their own industries. Why? Because colonies were supposed to buy manufactured goods from Europe, not compete with them. Even basic processing of raw materials was often prohibited. Infrastructure built for extraction. Railways and roads connected mines and plantations to ports, but they didn't connect regions within colonies to each other. This made internal trade difficult and meant that even after independence, many African countries found it easier to trade with Europe than with their neighbors. Land alienation. In settler colonies like Kenya, Rhodesia, and South Africa, the best agricultural land was seized for European settlers. Africans were pushed onto marginal land, creating land hunger and resentment that continues today. Why does this matter for politics? Because at independence, African countries inherited economies that were deeply integrated into global capitalism but in a subordinate, dependent position. They produced raw materials but couldn't set prices. They needed to import manufactured goods but had little foreign exchange to pay for them. This economic vulnerability gave former colonial powers and international financial institutions enormous leverage over post-independence African governments. Want loans? Accept these conditions. Want aid? Open your markets. Want investment? Privatize your industries. Economic dependence undermined political independence. The politics of post-colonial Africa cannot be understood without understanding this economic reality. By the mid-20th century, African nationalism was rising. 2 world wars had weakened European powers. The Atlantic Charter promised self-determination, and a generation of educated Africans demanded freedom. But here's what's often overlooked. Most African countries didn't win independence through revolution. They negotiated it. Britain, France, and Belgium realized that holding on to colonies was becoming too expensive and troublesome. They agreed to grant independence, but on their terms. What did this mean? First, the arbitrary colonial borders remained. African nationalists made a pragmatic decision at the founding of the Organization of African Unity in 1963. They would accept colonial borders to avoid endless border wars. This was probably wise in the short term, but it meant that the fundamental territorial illogic of African states remained. Second, the colonial administrative structures remained largely intact. The same bureaucracies, the same legal systems, often even the same officials, just now reporting to African rather than European leaders. Third, economic ties to the former colonizers remained strong. France was particularly explicit about this, creating the CFA franc currency zone that still ties 14 African countries to French monetary policy. Other European powers maintained trade agreements, military bases, and economic influence. Fourth, the political culture of authoritarianism continued. Many independence leaders, having spent years fighting colonial rule through centralized liberation movements, simply transferred that centralized authority to themselves once in power. Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, Jomo Kenyatta in Kenya, Felix Houphouët-Boigny in Côte d'Ivoire, they all became increasingly authoritarian after independence. Were they power-hungry tyrants? Some perhaps, but they also faced enormous challenges. Nations that had never existed before, populations divided along ethnic lines, economies in shambles, Cold War pressures, and constant interference from former colonial powers. The sad irony is that in trying to build national unity and develop their countries quickly, many African leaders reproduced the authoritarian colonial state they had fought against. So how does all of this affect African politics today, more than 60 years after most countries gained independence? Border conflicts continue. From the Western Sahara to Eritrea and Ethiopia, from Somalia to South Sudan, many of Africa's conflicts are rooted in the arbitrary borders drawn by colonial powers. The most recent example is South Sudan, which became independent in 2011 but has been racked by civil war since 2013, fighting largely along ethnic lines that were hardened and politicized during colonial rule. Ethnic politics remain dominant. In many African countries, elections are essentially ethnic censuses. People vote for candidates from their ethnic group, not because they are tribalistic, but because colonialism created a zero-sum political culture where controlling the state means access to resources, and losing means exclusion. Kenya, Nigeria, DRC, Ethiopia. These are all countries where ethnicity remains a primary political cleavage, thanks in large part to colonial divide-and-rule strategies. Weak states and strong presidents. The pattern established under colonialism, where power is concentrated at the top with weak institutions below, continues in many countries. Presidents control vast networks of patronage, while parliaments, courts, and civil society remain weak. This is a colonial administrative model, just with African faces. Economic dependency persists. Despite decades of independence, many African countries still export raw materials and import manufactured goods, just like during colonial times. International financial institutions and former colonial powers still exert enormous influence through loans, aid, and trade agreements. The language question. Most African countries still use a colonial language for government, education, and business. This isn't just symbolic. It creates a divide between the educated elite who speak French or English or Portuguese and the masses who speak indigenous languages. This linguistic divide often mirrors a political divide between governors and governed. But here's the important part. None of this means African countries are doomed or that Africans are helpless victims. Since independence, there have been remarkable achievements. Countries like Botswana building stable democracies, Rwanda rebuilding after genocide, Ghana becoming a beacon of democratic governance, African economies growing, literacy rates soaring, and African leaders increasingly charting their own course. The point isn't that colonialism determines everything. It's that colonialism created structures and patterns that shape the context in which African politics operates. Understanding this history doesn't excuse poor leadership or corruption. It contextualizes the challenges African nations face and highlights why solutions need to be rooted in African realities, not imported wholesale from elsewhere. So, what have we learned today? Colonialism didn't just involve foreign rule for a few decades. It fundamentally restructured African political systems, deliberately divided communities, imposed arbitrary borders that ignored existing political and cultural realities, created extractive rather than developmental states, built authoritarian governance structures, and integrated African economies into global capitalism in a dependent position. These aren't excuses. They are explanations. They help us understand why. For example, building democracy in countries with no democratic traditions is hard. Why ethnic tensions persist in countries where ethnicity was deliberately weaponized. Why economic development is challenging when your economy is structured to export raw materials rather than create value. The good news? Understanding the problem is the first step to solving it. Across Africa, there are movements working to overcome these colonial legacies, promoting indigenous languages, strengthening democratic institutions, building regional economic integration, addressing historical injustices, and creating political systems rooted in African values and realities rather than colonial impositions. The future of African politics won't be determined by the colonial past, but it will be shaped by how well Africans understand that past and work to transcend it. If you found this video valuable, please give it a like and subscribe. It really helps the algorithm show this content to more people. And here's my question for you. What aspect of colonial legacy do you think are most important to address? Are there specific countries or regions you'd like me to explore in future videos? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one, and your suggestions often become future videos. If you want to dive deeper into African history and politics, I've got a whole playlist linked in the description. We've covered everything from ancient African kingdoms to contemporary political movements. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next video. We've got some fascinating content coming up, including a deep dive into the economic systems of pre-colonial Africa and how modern African nations are reclaiming their narrative. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.